I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, the podcast that seeks to expand our understanding of beauty, what it is, how it works, and why it matters for the work we do. This season of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and is focused on the beauty and burdens of innovation. Hey everyone, this is the second half of my interview with Wendy Cadge and Michael Skaggs. Please check out the first half if you haven't already. In this part of our conversation, we talk about their new project on the spiritual infrastructure of the future. We look at how shifting demographics and congregational closures are reshaping where people find meaning and care, and what it will take to build innovative systems that are inclusive, accessible, and sustainable. We also discuss the burdens of innovation in spiritual care, from financial constraints to institutional inertia, and why, even with new technologies like AI, nothing can quite replace the beauty of human connection. Let's get started. Would you be able to also comment on perhaps where you might see the greatest need for innovation in this field? What is the sort of biggest burning problem where innovation is needed?
I think there are two big burning problems. The first is that the public doesn't have a clear sense of what chaplaincy or spiritual care is. And even in the survey data where people who have had contact are quite satisfied with their engagement with chaplains and spiritual care, the field, the people who do the work don't have a collective sense of who they are and what they do that is well understood by the American public. That's problem one. And problem two, let's call it an opportunity, is the business models. So, legacy chaplaincy is offered through organizations. So if you're in the military, you can find a chaplain. It's actually a federal requirement. Certain healthcare organizations are required by the Joint Commission, their regulatory bodies, to ensure that spiritual care is available, often provided by a chaplain. If you are not in a hospital or in the military and you think this might be helpful, there is no obvious place to go and find said person. And so the work that Trace has been doing with a number of colleagues, including Amy, has been to think about or to try to figure out, is there a single understanding that could be used to help this field grow and have a common core that could be communicated? And then what are the business models to enable this? And if they're only through organizations, that's limiting. If they were only individual, that would be limiting too. But right now, there's not a dollars and cents model that makes that work. You can think about subscription models. So I think those are the two biggest challenges / opportunities. And I think one of the important questions is whether the people who help to answer those questions are called chaplains or if they're just doing the work. And I personally, from what we have learned, especially in recent years, think we need to prioritize the work over the label. But then do you need a new label or a new framework? Yes, probably. But then now we're many steps down the road. So I think business model and sense of what the work is and how to share, communicate, market it are the two most important questions for this field.
Michael, would you agree, or would you have other priorities that you think are important?
One thing that I see on a daily basis in the lab is a question of religious demographics. And here's what I mean by that. On the one hand, very well trained and educated chaplains will and do serve anyone and everyone. And they are prepared to do that across a wide range of religious literacy, non-spiritual identification, or whatever the case may be. On the other hand, you very well may want a chaplain from your religious tradition. And this becomes an issue if you are from a statistically minority faith tradition in the United States. And it's a problem, especially for those traditions that may not have sort of a clear-cut concept of chaplaincy like some of the other traditions. And this becomes an issue because you will have people out of those traditions that feel called to this work, even if they don't want to call themselves chaplains. They might want to use some other term. But it can be extraordinarily difficult for them to find educational opportunities to actually learn how to be a chaplain, because so many of our institutions of education and clinical training remain very historically Christian. And so that can be a real problem for the people who are trying to get into the field. And so why do I hear about this every day in the lab? It's because we're trying to identify those opportunities and help funnel people towards the places that are going to nourish those parts of themselves, which are very important, so that they can now do the work of spiritual care, even if their tradition doesn't have a clear conception.
I wonder, are issues of legal concerns around training and credentialing and liabilities, an issue in these cases where if there is a body that can, accredit chaplains, then perhaps certain institutions are more comfortable with that. But if it is like a minority tradition where there is no, institution that can credential a chaplain and provide a kind of standardized training, they might be suspicious. Is that sort of thing a concern? Does that come up?
It's definitely a concern. And I have two examples of that. One, we will hear fairly often, well, why doesn't the lab just push for there to be a legal definition of a chaplain so that, the state will license chaplains just like they license medical providers or whatever else? I'm not speaking for the lab and myself. I think that's a terrible idea because that definition is going to be open to interpretation and revision until the end of time. On the other hand, even among organizations that are willing to host or employ chaplains or whatever, if leadership in those organizations doesn't quite understand the nuances of who becomes a chaplain, you'll end up with a situation where, maybe there's a leadership job opening in a healthcare system and they'll say this person must be board certified, they must have X number of units of clinical pastoral education, and they must be an ordained religious leader. Well, that cuts out everybody whose tradition doesn't ordain, or maybe they are from a tradition who doesn't ordain them in particular. And so there are some misconceptions about that are still about. It's a very long-term process to go about addressing them. And it is an opportunity for education with some of those institutions to say, hey, you're missing some of the picture here. Maybe let's think about this in a larger frame.
My worry is that so much airspace and ink has been spilled thinking about those questions, Brandon. They're all what we call demand side questions. They're all about, who are the right people to do the job. But if the people who are being served don't even know what the job is, I don't think they're the right strategic questions, because we can move letters around all we want. But if nobody knows why they would call the person with the letters after their names, who cares? So as we have learned more about what we call the demand side, or just the experiences of the American public, I think the questions you ask are very important, but I think that they are secondary questions to asking if anybody knows who a chaplain is and how to find one and who's going to pay for that person to do the work. That said, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it has felt historically like 90% of the things that chaplains can talk about are in response to your question. And so I try to be provocative with them to get them to spend less time thinking about those questions and more time focused on those they serve, how they serve them, but if those people even know who they are.
Right. I want to pivot to asking you about the more recent work you've been doing on this concept called the spiritual infrastructure of the future, which I think really builds on what we've been talking about. Could you say a little bit about that initiative and what do you mean by spiritual infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's a 3 or 4 year project that's just getting started. And Amy and I, Michael, some colleagues, had been doing unrelated projects trying to map both those who call themselves spiritual innovators to understand what they're doing and who they are, and also trying to understand some church and congregational closures. And my sense, with my sociologist hat on, is that we are seeing a shift in delivery mechanisms for spiritual and religious content. And while the congregation in the United States has long been the primary delivery mechanism, and for many people it absolutely still is, there are others for whom it is not the primary delivery mechanism. And we're trying to understand that. And we were thinking about that both from the perspective of individuals, but also being aware of the history of religious organizations in social infrastructures. And so this is a project designed to ask a question about how the spiritual or religious infrastructures, the institutions, not just the congregations, but the ways that different hospitals, social service organizations, community centers, et cetera, interact in particular cities, and to ask if there's a way for us to see some of those transitions in real time. So the project has a few arms. The research component is going to focus in 4 cities: Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and very likely Oklahoma City. And we're going to focus in city centers to see if we can understand what's opening, what's closing, how are these delivery mechanisms shifting. The other 2 pieces of the project, one focuses on public understandings and trying to support journalists in telling a range of stories about contemporary American religious life, not just the stories about decline. And the third part of the project is really designed to ensure that experts in this field continue to be nurtured through graduate school and into positions inside and outside of the academy to provide the thought leadership that is essential going forward. And that is an internship program that will enable PhD students in related fields to do paid internships outside of the academy to develop relationships with foundations and different kinds of organizations where that thought leadership happens to ensure that we are continuing to build a robust pipeline to think and understand and provide thought leadership about these important questions.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and it's exciting, really, really ambitious, exciting initiative. Could you say a little bit about what impact you hope it would have? If it's immensely successful, what would that look like for you?
So my sense, we need to think about audience, right? So my sense is that in the scholarly world, there have been a couple of really important books about the state of American religion. Bob Withnow's 1998 Restructuring of American Religion book is one. Bob Putnam's book is one. There's a handful, but as scholars, it always takes us time to catch up to what's happening and to try to tell these broad sort of stories. So Bob Withnow and Penny Edgell are actually editing a book as part of this project in which we try to step back and tell that broad story. So to me, if this project is wildly successful, we know a little bit more in closer to real time about how institutions are shifting on the ground in response to the changes that are taking place in many areas of contemporary religious life. And that additional understanding spurs all of us in the public through articles in the newspaper, in where people are thinking about their training and where they're looking to kind of engage around questions of meaning and purpose, to understand and see more options and to make the choices that are right for us. So we're trying to advance understanding in a scholarly way, but also in a public way. And also, I think, as people think about vocations in a range of settings.
That's great. Could you all just sort of zooming out a little bit, say something about perhaps the purchase of the concept of innovation as being valuable for the study of religion and even, both from a scholarly perspective, a sociological perspective, but also for practitioners? Is it helping shine a light on something that we're not seeing otherwise? And also conversely, are there any pitfalls of focusing on innovation as a concept?
So we've been thinking about that very question because innovation is a new-ish concept. We've done the Google Ngram searches, and you can see it gaining in popularity. In my view, innovation is a way to talk about change. And so we've been talking about a working paper in which we might look at genealogies of religious change, where innovation is one amongst others, because it's impossible to define innovation and because it's so context dependent. So I think we're trying to think about how to contextualize the term, and the fact that it's currently popular and sounds kind of cool is not a good operational definition when it's really a way of talking about change. And especially in American religious life, there's many, many changes. So I'm not answering your question as much as complexifying it.
That's
and
fine.
being skeptical. If we put all of our eggs in the innovation bucket, I'm not sure it allows us to tell the whole stories. And what is innovative to one person, family, religious tradition is not to another. And that level of granularity is important and also impossible to deal with as a scholar. So I don't know, Michael, I'd be curious about how you think about that. And Brandon, I'd love to know how you think about it.
Yeah, well, as a historian, Michael, I'm very curious about your perspective too. So,
Well, we're touching on very deep parts of people and institutions. I think that there is a risk sometimes that when those institutions hear a word like innovation, it seems combative, or you're trying to push us in a direction that we don't want to go, or you're going to leave behind what is truly of value, or whatever the case may be. And I think a very important part of this message is that that's not the point. The point is not to get rid of American religion as it currently stands, right? That's not what innovation means. In one sort of definition, it means drawing on the strengths of our institutions and infrastructure as we have them now to better meet the needs of people where they are. Wendy used this word many times in her response. She said shift, right? Not jettison, not bulldoze and build anew, shift, right?
Yeah.
So we have, in many ways, the raw material to address these needs all around us. It's looking at it from a different perspective and being willing to think about how those resources are put to use in a different way that will allow us to innovate however we choose to define the word.
Yeah, yeah. It becomes, it is a really, really thorny concept, and that's why I'm really intrigued by the ways in which both we could use it as scholars, but also pay attention to some of the baggage that comes with the term, and there's of course the distinction between the kinds of things we mean by innovation, the kinds of shifts and changes and adaptations, and we might mean that there's something significant about those changes. They're not just merely incremental modifications, but there's something that some community is judging as a significant and useful change for some end that they're hoping to achieve. But then the word itself can carry a lot of baggage with it. Are there particular places where, as you're doing this work of mapping this shifting spiritual infrastructure, that you're seeing beauty emerge in some of these spiritual innovations, perhaps, and yeah, any places that you're particularly drawn to?
I mean, my off the cuff response is that so much of this work is about enabling people to see beauty that they would otherwise overlook,
Hmm.
and or I don't want to say creating the conditions, because I don't believe we create beauty. I think it's revealed, but to have spaces where it may be revealed where it's least expected. So I think that's sort of like asking a question about God, and I would
Right,
probably give a similar answer.
right.
I think so much of the work of chaplains is assisting people to see beauty when they think it is impossible to do so. So many
Mm,
chaplains are working
mm,
with people with a terminal medical diagnosis, or they've just suffered a catastrophic death in their family, or whatever the case may be. And when those things happen, quite rightly, you think there is nothing more that is good about my life. Things have changed so drastically that I cannot possibly see beauty anywhere. And it's
mm,
not something that happens over the course of a 10-minute conversation, but I think chaplains being part of witnessing that difficulty, witnessing the vulnerability, and inviting people to discover what it is that helps them make meaning can really turn those objectively negative experiences into a moment of beauty in a way that certainly would not have happened without someone providing spiritual care to that person.
mm, mm. Wow, that's wonderful. Is there one thing that the public generally tends to get wrong about chaplains? That, I mean, you've mentioned a few things, but is there something that you really want to correct in the public imagination around chaplains, or at least to maybe the the folks who have the funding resources, whether it's mayors or hospital CEOs or whoever, right? Is there some kind of perception there that you really love to shift and help make a case for the importance of chaplains?
I can't remember what year it was, Wendy, but there was the actor from MASH who died, and we were a little opportunistic and took this opportunity to publish an article somewhere. I can't remember where, but the title was Father Mulcahy is Dead. And the thrust was a lot of folks think about a chaplain as a white Christian male who's wearing a collar. And there are
Mm,
plenty of white Christian males wearing collars who are still chaplains, and that's good and fine. But more and more and more chaplains don't look like that. And
mm,
most chaplains don't do the kind of work that Father Mulcahy was doing in the war. Now, how do you shift that perception? I don't know. Maybe
mm.
we start paying for multi-million-dollar ads here in football season so we can get the most people. I don't know, but that is a major shift in perception that we've got to push.
Mm,
I actually prefer the term spiritual care provider because I think it's more inclusive. And if you look just at that term, spiritual care providers are those who tend to our spirits, to the things that keep us going in all the frames. And so, what I would want to say to leaders across the country is that I think it's undeniable that many of us are struggling with our spirits. And we can see that in polarization and many contemporary social challenges. And no chaplain can fix that. But why would you not tend to someone's spirit if you had the opportunity? And that can take many forms. And it can include the word religion if that makes sense for your demographic, but it needn't. And in general, chaplains are relatively inexpensive. And so I would just encourage people to try things out, do a pilot. There's a great body of research in the UK that shows that embedding spiritual care providers in primary care clinics makes a difference for everybody in the clinic. They are not Father Mulcahy. They are people who provide a listening service
mm.
around, usually the research shows around grief and life transitions, that patients really appreciate. and that nurses and doctors really appreciate, because nurses and doctors never have enough time during the day to serve and attend to all of the reasons why people are there. When that feels like religion in a medical clinic, people can be very concerned. But when that's simply about a listening presence and coming alongside and tending people's spirit, why not try it and see if it works?
I had a conversation just maybe last week with a person who has a nonprofit organization to provide spiritual care to a community that is involved in a very dangerous and very expensive hobby. And I shouldn't say more than that because that person didn't know I was going to talk about this. But this person said, look, the folks that I work with, that I provide spiritual care for, they are obscenely wealthy. All of their material needs are met. And in that demographic, they don't need God. They don't want God. But we'll be out in the field doing this hobby and they'll say, my spouse is leaving me and I have no idea what to do.
Mm.
And that's not a question that has an answer, but it is something that having someone who is well trained and prepared to stand there and talk to you while you're engaged in something that you love to do about this enormous life change that is looming over you is really important.
Mm.
We have a section on the Chaplaincy Innovation website that's called "This is what a chaplain looks like." And we
Okay.
encourage people to Google it. We've encouraged any chaplain who wants to be included there to send us their photo and a bio, because it really shows the breadth of possibilities in this work. And part of what Michael does in his leadership now in the lab is help people who want to try things out figure out what they might look like. And one of the lab's greatest resources is its networks and our ability to introduce people with an idea to someone who's tried it or might try it. And, this is where we facilitate innovation, which means experimentation, trying things out that may or may not work and learning together through that process.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So in this particular time we're in with both in terms of the political uncertainty and upheavals that are going on, but also in terms of the rise of AI and new technologies, are you seeing any especially critical needs to protect the value of or highlight the value of spiritual care, and is that going to take new forms, you think? How do you see that?
Michael, this one's for you. I texted Michael about this the other day and he said, oh, he'd already been doing all these things. So
This is something that really intelligent thinkers are thinking very hard about, because I would imagine most of us agree that AI is already pervading our lives. It is going to continue to do so. We can't push back the tide. It's here to stay. What does that actually mean for something like spiritual care? There is a really easy answer that says, well, as long as you train the model well enough, why can't AI be a spiritual care provider? You can ask it questions. It'll have conversations with you. It gets to know your personality. That is extraordinarily dangerous and I think irresponsible. But that is one thing that we have to contend with. On the other hand, we have to think about what are all of these sort of administrative tasks and bureaucratic things that chaplains have to do day in and day out. Can AI be a tool to free them up to be more creative and be more direct and personal with people? If so, that's great. But I think we are heading towards a point where the conversation over what makes us human is going to be very top of mind for all of us. I would guess that all of us have an answer, but pretty soon it's going to be unavoidable and it's going to determine the course of where society goes.
there's a great recent article, and I'm going to forget all the details, written by a theological educator who had an accident and was in the emergency room and decided to ask AI all kinds of core questions. And it outlines the answers AI could give and the answers AI would not give, and how that's different when you talk to a AI module through a Catholic, a Mormon, et cetera lens. And what I left that article, which is what I was sending to Michael, what I left that article thinking about is that AI is a tool. It's a kind of exoskeleton for the mind. Sure, we can train it up to do some of this work. But for me, what makes us human is that real connection, that real improvisation, that ability to sit and touch and be with other people, not a bot. And when things are wonderful and when things are difficult. And so I think AI is another tool that can enable the work of spiritual care to be done perhaps in some different ways. I think we need to embrace it and play with it and try it out. Will it replace it? No, but I don't believe that AI is going to replace the humanness of us if we continue to use it as ethically as appropriate.
Yeah, let's hope so. It's a real danger, and I think, as you had used the word empaths, Michael, to describe spiritual care providers, and I think that particular capacity to be moved, right, and to respond because one is moved, and therefore to be present because one has suffered in some way and can therefore resonate with the suffering of another, seems so critical to highlight and to value in these times. I want to thank you for the important work you're doing and for being so generous with your time. Where can we direct our viewers and listeners to so they can learn more about the work you're doing?
It's very easy, chaplaincyinnovation.org. Everything that we have talked about is right there, including a lot of information about the project on the spiritual infrastructure of the future. So I really encourage everyone to check all of that out. And you can always get in touch with us directly. It's just info@chaplaincyinnovation.org. There are many days where I think I'm mostly a glorified traffic cop and I direct people to go talk to other people, but that's fine. I love doing that. So if people have questions or want to continue the conversation, we certainly will.
Amazing. Well, thank you both again. This has been a real delight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with someone who would find it of interest. Also, please subscribe and leave us a review if you haven't already. Thanks, and see you next time.